Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 589, Usufruct. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am allergic. I am allergic to something. My eyes are allergic to something. I think this happened last year and the year before and the year before that, but not the year before that. So I don't know. I am not at all sure what it is that is doing this to my eyes, but Thing 2 has recommended that I buy a gas mask. That is the solution that has been offered to me, so I'm not there yet. I'm getting close, but I'm not there yet, although it would make a great photo op. That said, however, everything else is pretty darn good. Good and full of new words. Usufruct, the name of this episode, is interesting because there's a difference between the Merriam-Webster online dictionary and the OED. And it's subtle, but I think it says a lot. Usufruct comes from Latin. It's a smashing together of, I think, 3 original Latin words. Usus et fructus, which means use and enjoyment. And I'm willing to bet dollars to donuts that I just butchered the Latin. But that said, I'm apparently pronouncing usufruct correctly. I thought it was a German word. So not a German word. But its usage is interesting. So if the original intent of this word that has been smashed into one, these 3 words that have been smashed into one, use and enjoyment, the meaning hasn't changed. Usufruct still means using something that you don't own for your own enjoyment, like temporary enjoyment. Now, Thomas Jefferson used the word, "The earth belongs in usufruct to the living," which I think is interesting because, for one thing, he knew that it was temporary usage. It's a legal term. It's actually used as a legal term. There is usually an end point to the term of usage that you get from usufruct. It seems to be kind of just a thing. It's not like it doesn't seem like anybody gets granted specifically and only rights of usufruct. That doesn't seem to show up in any of the things that I'm seeing. Often it shows up as usufruct and enjoyment in the OED, which is kind of redundant, but it also kind of keeps it clear. The thing that I thought was interesting is that the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which is certainly in common usage, ends at the something belonging to another, the legal right of using and enjoying the fruits or profits of something belonging to another. That's where their definition ends. For the OED, it's the right of temporary possession, use, or enjoyment of the advantages of property belonging to another. But then it continues. So far as may be had without causing damage or prejudice to this property. That last bit's missing from the Merriam-Webster, and that last bit is also what makes Thomas Jefferson's quote, I think, make more sense. Because if, as Jefferson seems to have felt, we are stewards of the land, we're here to use, yes, enjoy, yes, but also care for and protect the land. That makes sense. That fits with this definition of usufruct, and I think a more useful definition of usufruct, because what's the point if you are told that you're legally allowed to just use and enjoy something, and if you use it up, whatever, well, then that becomes theft. So usufruct actually does have this extra additional, you can't cause damage to the thing that you're using and enjoying. So like pollution would be bad. It would be violating usufruct, that kind of thing. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting. And why did I think it was interesting? I thought it was interesting because it pops up in our second chapter today. Today's going to be a long chapter. I don't actually have a whole lot at the beginning. I have a little at the end. The main thing is the 3 chapters that we're listening to, they're all about the same length. The first one and the last one are historical. The middle one is another comedy one where Twain is being Twain. Twain is also, I think, probably weaving in a little bit more of himself and, well, the way he made a living part of the time. He talks about someone who has a narrative gift. And then, of course, he qualifies that as a deep and rare honor, which is how you know he's probably talking about himself in that respect. But he talks about storytelling and about what happens if you're a really good storyteller, what happens to you, and how things grow and how you lose track of what the original reality was, which is psychologically fascinating to study, but also, I think, really well explained here. There are also some surprisingly lovely passages in that second section. And if not lovely, at least really, really well constructed for the humor. Like the part of the joke that he saves for the end. It's not always a punchline. It's not da-dun-dun, tsh. It's usually more subtle than that, and therefore really wonderful. Unless you're Tara. Tara, if you skip the second chapter today, it won't matter. But the first and the third chapters, those are important. I also figured out, I've been looking at this whole time. I don't know how I didn't notice this before. In the LibriVox version that John Greenman is reading to us, there are chapter titles. So we hear Book 2, chapters 6 through 8. But then we also hear names of those chapters. Those chapter names didn't appear in the first edition of the book. The text that I'm actually working from is a photostatic copy of the original texts. I think I mentioned that before. So all of the spacing is what you would have seen had you owned a copy of the book back when it was published. Yeah, it's just got chapter numbers. So I am not entirely sure when those chapter names were added or whether Twain added them later. Either way, they're not in the first edition. And the last thing I want to say before you start listening is this. The title of the third chapter may throw you because you may think, wait a minute, that doesn't happen yet. And the answer is, just so you don't worry about it, yes, it does. Obviously, because the chapter it has a correct title. It's just not the one that appeared in the first edition. It did happen. It did happen like this. It did happen in this time, in this order. And it was much, much friendlier than what comes later. All right, now that you have a mystery to listen for, I'm going to turn you over to John Greenman reading Book 2, chapters 6 through 8 of Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. Here we go.
Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, Book 2, Chapter 6, Joan Convinces the King. Well, anything to make delay, the King's council advised him against arriving at a decision in our matter too precipitately. He arrive at a decision too precipitately? So they sent a committee of priests, always priests, into Lorraine to inquire into Joan's character and history, a matter which would consume several weeks, of course. You see how fastidious they were. It was as if people should come to put out the fire when a man's house was burning down, and they waited till they could send into another county to find out if he had always kept the Sabbath or not, before letting him try. So the days poked along, dreary for us young people in some ways, but not in all, for we had one great anticipation in front of us. We had never seen a king, and now some day we should have that prodigious spectacle to see and to treasure in our memories all our lives. So we were on the lookout, and always eager and watching for the chance. The others were doomed to wait longer than I, as it turned out. One day great news came. The Orleans commissioners, with Yolande and our knights, had at last turned the council's position and persuaded the king to see Joan. Joan received the immense news gratefully, but without losing her head. But with us others it was otherwise. We could not eat or sleep or do any rational thing for the excitement and the glory of it. During 2 days our pair of noble knights were in distress and trepidation on Joan's account, for the audience was to be at night, and they were afraid that Joan would be so paralyzed by the glare of light from the long files of torches the solemn pomps and ceremonies, the great concourse of renowned personages, the brilliant costumes, and the other splendors of the court, that she, a simple country maid, and all unused to such things, would be overcome by these terrors and make a piteous failure. No doubt I could have comforted them, but I was not free to speak. Would Joan be disturbed by this cheap spectacle, this tinsel show with its small king and his butterfly dukelets? She who had spoken face to face with the princes of heaven, the familiars of God, and seen their retinue of angels stretching back into the remoteness of the sky, myriads upon myriads, like a measureless fan of light, a glory like the glory of the sun streaming from each of those innumerable heads, the massed radiance filling the deeps of space with a blinding splendor? I thought not. Queen Yolande wanted Joan to make the best possible impression upon the king and the court, so she was strenuous to have her clothed in the richest stuffs, wrought upon the princeliest pattern, and set off with jewels. But in that she had to be disappointed, of course, Joan not being persuadable to it, but begging to be simply and sincerely dressed, as became a servant of God, and one sent upon a mission of a serious sort and grave political import. So then the gracious queen imagined and contrived that simple and witching costume which I have described to you so many times, and which I cannot think of even now in my dull age without being moved just as rhythmical and exquisite music moves me. For that was music, that dress. That is what it was, music that one saw with the eyes and felt in the heart. Yes, she was a poem, she was a dream, she was a spirit when she was clothed in that. She kept that raiment always, and wore it several times upon occasions of state, and it is preserved to this day in the treasury of Orleans, with 2 of her swords, and her banner, and other things now sacred because they had belonged to her. At the appointed time the Count of Vendôme, a great lord of the court, came richly clothed with his train of servants and assistants, to conduct Joan to the king, and the 2 knights and I went with her, being entitled to this privilege by reason of our official positions near her person. When we entered the great audience hall, there it all was just as I have already painted it. Here were ranks of guards in shining armor and with polished halberds. 2 sides of the hall were like flower gardens for variety of color and the magnificence of the costumes. Light streamed upon these masses of color from 250 flambeaux. There was a wide, free space down the middle of the hall, and at the end of it was a throne royally canopied, and upon it sat a crowned and sceptered figure, nobly clothed and blazing with jewels. It is true that Joan had been hindered and put off a good while, but now that she was admitted to an audience at last, she was received with honors granted to only the greatest personages. At the entrance door stood 4 heralds in a row, in splendid tabards, with long, slender silver trumpets at their mouths, with square silken banners depending from them embroidered with the arms of France. As Joan and the Count passed by, these trumpets gave forth in unison one long, rich note, and as we moved down the hall under the pictured and gilded vaulting, this was repeated at every 50 feet of our progress, 6 times in all. It made our good knights proud and happy, and they held themselves erect, and stiffened their stride, and looked fine and soldierly. They were not expecting this beautiful and honorable tribute to our little country maid. Joan walked 2 yards behind the Count. We 3 walked 2 yards behind Joan. Our solemn march ended when we were as yet some 8 or 10 steps from the throne. The Count made a deep obeisance, pronounced Joan's name, then bowed again, and moved to his place among a group of officials near the throne. I was devouring the crowned personage with all my eyes, and my heart almost stood still with awe. The eyes of all others were fixed upon Joan in a gaze of wonder which was half worship, and which seemed to say, "How sweet, how lovely, how divine!" All lips were parted and motionless, which was a sure sign that those people who seldom forget themselves had forgotten themselves now, and were not conscious of anything but the one object they were gazing upon. They had the look of people who are under the enchantment of a vision. Then they presently began to come to life again, rousing themselves out of the spell, and shaking it off as one drives away little by little a clinging drowsiness or intoxication. Now they fixed their attention upon Joan with a strong new interest of another sort. They were full of curiosity to see what she would do, they having a secret and particular reason for this curiosity. So they watched. This is what they saw. She made no obeisance, nor even any slight inclination of her head, but stood looking toward the throne in silence. That was all there was to see at present. I glanced up at Demetz, and was shocked at the paleness of his face. I whispered and said, "What is it, man? What is it?" His answering whisper was so weak I could hardly catch it. "They have taken advantage of the hint in her letter to play a trick upon her. She will err, and they will laugh at her. That is not the king that sits there." Then I glanced at Joan. She was still gazing steadfastly toward the throne, and I had the curious fancy that even her shoulders and the back of her head expressed bewilderment. Now she turned her head slowly, and her eye wandered along the lines of standing courtiers till it fell upon a young man who was very quietly dressed. Then her face lighted joyously, and she ran and threw herself at his feet, and clasped his knees, exclaiming in that soft melodious voice which was her birthright, and was now charged with deep and tender feeling, "God of his grace give you long life, O dear and gentle Dauphin!" In his astonishment and exultation Demetz cried out, "By the shadow of God, it is an amazing thing!" Then he mashed all the bones of my hand in his grateful grip, and added with a proud shake of his mane, "Now what have these painted infidels to say?" Meantime the young person in the plain clothes was saying to Joan, "Ah, you mistake, my child. I am not the king. There he is," and he pointed to the throne. The knight's face clouded, and he muttered in grief and indignation, "Ah, it is a shame to use her so, but for this lie she had gone through safe. I will go and proclaim to all the house what—" "Stay where you are," whispered I and the Sieur Bertrand in a breath, and made him stop in his place. Joan did not stir from her knees, but still lifted her happy face toward the king, and said, "No, gracious liege, you are he, and none other." Demetz's troubles vanished away, and he said, "Verily she was not guessing, she knew. Now how could she know? It is a miracle. I am content, and will meddle no more, for I perceive that she is equal to her occasions, having that in her head that cannot profitably be helped by the vacancy that is in mine." This interruption of his lost me a remark or two of the other talk. However, I caught the king's next question, "But tell me who you are, and what would you?" "I am called Joan the Maid, and am sent to say that the King of Heaven wills that you be crowned and consecrated in your good city of Rheims, and be thereafter lieutenant of the Lord of Heaven, who is King of France. And he willeth also that you set me at my appointed work and give me men-at-arms." After a slight pause she added, her eye lighting at the sound of her words, "For then I will raise the siege of Orleans and break the English power." The young monarch's amused face sobered a little when this martial speech fell upon that sick air like a breath blown from embattled camps and fields of war, and this trifling smile presently faded wholly away and disappeared. He was grave now and thoughtful. After a little he waved his hand lightly, and all the people fell away and left those two by themselves in a vacant space. The knights and I moved to the opposite side of the hall and stood there. We saw Joan rise at a sign, then she and the king talked privately together. All that host had been consumed with curiosity to see what Joan would do. Well, they had seen, and now they were full of astonishment to see that she had really performed that strange miracle according to the promise in her letter, and they were fully as much astonished to find that she was not overcome by the pomps and splendors about her, but was even more tranquil and at her ease in holding speech with a monarch than ever they themselves had been, with all their practice and experience. As for our two knights, they were inflated beyond measure with pride in Joan, but nearly dumb as to speech, they not being able to think out any way to account for her managing to carry herself through this imposing ordeal without ever a mistake or an awkwardness of any kind to mar the grace and credit of her great performance. The talk between Joan and the king was long and earnest, and held in low voices. We could not hear, but we had our eyes and could note effects, and presently we and all the house noted one effect which was memorable and striking, and has been set down in memoirs and histories and in testimony at the process of rehabilitation by some who witnessed it. For all knew it was big with meaning, though none knew what that meaning was at that time, of course. For suddenly we saw the king shake off his indolent attitude and straighten up like a man, and at the same time look immeasurably astonished. It was as if Joan had told him something almost too wonderful for belief, and yet of a most uplifting and welcome nature. It was long before we found out the secret of this conversation, but we know it now, and all the world knows it. That part of the talk was like this, as one may read in all histories. The perplexed king asked Joan for a sign. He wanted to believe in her and her mission, and that her voices were supernatural and endowed with knowledge hidden from mortals. But how could he do this unless these voices could prove their claim in some absolutely unassailable way? It was then that Joan said, "I will give you a sign, and you shall no more doubt. There is a secret trouble in your heart which you speak of to none, a doubt which wastes away your courage, and makes you dream of throwing all away and fleeing from your realm. Within this little while you have been praying in your own breast that God of his grace would resolve that doubt, even if the doing of it must show you that no kingly right is lodged in you." It was that amazed the king, for it was as she had said, his prayer was the secret of his own breast, and none but God could know about it. So he said, "The sign is sufficient. I know now that these voices are of God. They have said true in this matter. If they have said more, tell it me. I will believe. They have resolved that doubt, and I bring their very words, which are these: Thou art lawful heir to the king thy father, and true heir of France. God has spoken it. Now lift up thy head and doubt no more, but give me men-at-arms and let me get about my work." Telling him he was of lawful birth was what straightened him up and made a man of him for a moment, removing his doubts upon that head and convincing him of his royal right. And if any could have hanged his hindering and pestiferous counsel and set him free, he would have answered Joan's prayer and set her in the field. But no, those creatures were only checked, not checkmated. They could invent some more delays. We had been made proud by the honors which had so distinguished Joan's entrance into that place, honors restricted to personages of very high rank and worth. But that pride was as nothing compared with the pride we had in the honor done her upon leaving it. For whereas those first honors were shown only to the great, these last, up to this time, had been shown only to the royal. The king himself led Joan by the hand down the great hall to the door, the glittering multitude standing and making reverence as they passed, and the silver trumpets sounding those rich notes of theirs. Then he dismissed her with gracious words, bending low over her hand and kissing it. Always, from all companies high or low, she went forth richer in honor and esteem than when she came. And the king did another handsome thing by Joan, for he sent us back to Courdray Castle, torch-lighted and in state, under escort of his own troop, his guard of honor, the only soldiers he had, and finely equipped and bedizened they were, too, though they hadn't seen the color of their wages since they were children, as a body might say. The wonders which Joan had been performing before the king had been carried all around by this time, so the road was so packed with people who wanted to get a sight of her that we could hardly dig through. And as for talking together, we couldn't, all attempts at talk being drowned in the storm of shoutings and huzzas that broke out all along as we passed, and kept abreast of us like a wave the whole way. End of Book 2, Chapter 6. Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain, Chapter 7, Our Paladin in His Glory. We were doomed to suffer tedious waits and delays, and we settled ourselves down to our fate and bore it with a dreary patience, counting the slow hours and the dull days, and hoping for a turn when God should please to send it. The Paladin was the only exception; that is to say, he was the only one who was happy and had no heavy times. This was partly owing to the satisfaction he got out of his clothes. He bought them at second hand, a Spanish cavalier's complete suit, wide-brimmed hat with flowing plumes, lace collar and cuffs, faded velvet doublet and trunks, short cloak hung from the shoulder, funnel-topped buskins, long rapier, and all that, a graceful and picturesque costume, and the Paladin's great frame was the right place to hang it for effect. He wore it when off duty, and when he swaggered by with one hand resting on the hilt of his rapier, and twirling his new mustache with the other, everybody stopped to look and admire. And well they might, for he was a fine and stately contrast to the small French gentlemen of the day squeezed into the trivial French costume of the time. He was king bee of the little village that snuggled under the shelter of the frowning towers and bastions of Courdray Castle, and acknowledged lord of the tap-room of the inn. When he opened his mouth there, he got a hearing. Those simple artisans and peasants listened with deep and wondering interest, for he was a traveler and had seen the world, all of it that lay between Chinon and Domremy, at any rate, and that was a wide stretch more of it than they might ever hope to see. And he had been in battle, and knew how to paint its shock and struggle, its perils and surprises, with an art that was all his own. He was cock of that walk, hero of that hostelry. He drew custom as honey draw flies, so he was the pet of the innkeeper and of his wife and daughter, and they were his obliged and willing servants. Most people who have the narrative gift, that great and rare endowment, have with it the defect of telling their choice things over the same way every time, and this injures them and causes them to sound stale and wearisome after several repetitions. But it was not so with the Paladin, whose art was of a finer sort. It was more stirring and interesting to hear him tell about a battle the 10th time than it was the first time, because he did not tell it twice the same way, but always made a new battle of it and a better one, with more casualties on the enemy's side each time, and more general wreck and disaster all around, and more widows and orphans and suffering in the neighborhood where it happened. He could not tell his battles apart himself, except by their names, and by the time he had told one of them 10 times, it had grown so that there wasn't room enough in France for it any more, but was lapping over the edges. But up to that point the audience would not allow him to substitute a new battle, knowing that the old ones were the best, and sure to improve as long as France could hold them. And so, instead of saying to him as they would have said to another, "Give us something fresh, we are fatigued with that old thing," they would say, with one voice and with a strong interest, "Tell about the surprise at Beaulieu again. Tell it 3 or 4 times." That is a compliment which few narrative experts have heard in their lifetime. At first, when the Paladin heard us tell about the glories of the royal audience, he was broken-hearted because he was not taken with us to it. Next, his talk was full of what he would have done if he had been there, and within 2 days he was telling what he did do when he was there. His mill was fairly started now, and could be trusted to take care of its affair. Within 3 nights afterward, all his battles were taking a rest, for already his worshippers in the tap-room were so infatuated with the great tale of the royal audience that they would have nothing else, and so besotted with it were they that they would have cried if they could not have gotten it. Noel Rainguesson hid himself and heard it, and came and told me, and after that we went together to listen, bribing the inn-hostess to let us have her little private parlor, where we could stand at the wickets in the door and see and hear. The tap-room was large, yet had a snug and cozy look, with its inviting little tables and chairs scattered irregularly over its red brick floor, and its great fire flaming and crackling in the wide chimney. It was a comfortable place to be in on such chilly and blustering March nights as these, and a goodly company had taken shelter there, and were sipping their wine in contentment, and gossiping one with another in a neighborly way, while they waited for the historian. The host, the hostess, and their pretty daughter were flying here and there and yonder among the tables, and doing their best to keep up with the orders. The room was about 40 feet square, and a space or aisle down the center of it had been kept vacant and reserved for the Paladin's needs. At the end of it was a platform 10 or 12 feet wide, with a big chair and a small table on it, and 3 steps leading up to it. Among the wine-sippers were many familiar faces: the cobbler, the farrier, the blacksmith, the wheelwright, the armorer, the maltster, the weaver, the baker, the miller's man with his dusty coat, and so on. And conscious and important, as a matter of course, was the barber surgeon, for he is that in all villages, as he has to pull everybody's teeth and purge and bleed all the grown people once a month to keep their health sound. He knows everybody, and by constant contact with all sorts of folk becomes a master of etiquette and manners and a conversationalist of large facility. There were plenty of carriers, drovers, and their sort, and journeymen artisans. When the Paladin presently came sauntering indolently in, he was received with a cheer, and the barber hustled forward and greeted him with several low and most graceful and courtly bows, also taking his hand and touching his lips to it. Then he called in a loud voice for a stoup of wine for the Paladin, and when the host's daughter brought it up on the platform, and dropped her courtesy and departed, the barber called after her and told her to add the wine to his score. This won him ejaculations of approval, which pleased him very much and made his little rat eyes shine. And such applause is right and proper, for when we do a liberal and gallant thing it is but natural that we should wish to see notice taken of it. The barber called upon the people to rise and drink the Paladin's health, and they did it with alacrity and affectionate heartiness, clashing their metal flagons together with a simultaneous crash and heightening the effect with a resounding cheer. It was a fine thing to see how that young swashbuckler had made himself so popular in a strange land in so little a while, and without other helps to his advancement than just his tongue, and the talent to use it given him by God, a talent which was but one talent in the beginning, but was now become 10 through husbandry and the increment and usufruct that do naturally follow that and reward it as by a law. The people sat down and began to hammer on the tables with their flagons and called for "The King's audience! The King's audience! The King's audience!" The Paladin stood there in one of his best attitudes, with his plumed great hat tipped over to the left, the folds of his short cloak drooping from his shoulder, and the one hand resting upon the hilt of his rapier and the other lifting his beaker. As the noise died down he made a stately sort of a bow, which he had picked up somewhere, then fetched his beaker with a sweep to his lips, and tilted his head back and drained it to the bottom. The barber jumped for it and set it upon the Paladin's table. Then the Paladin began to walk up and down his platform with a great deal of dignity and quite at his ease. And as he walked he talked, and every little while stopped and stood facing his house, and so standing continued his talk. We went 3 nights in succession. It was plain that there was a charm about the performance that was apart from the mere interest which attaches to lying. It was presently discoverable that this charm lay in the Paladin's sincerity. He was not lying consciously, he believed what he was saying. To him his initial statements were facts, and whenever he enlarged a statement, the enlargement became a fact too. He put his heart into his extravagant narrative, just as a poet puts his heart into a heroic fiction, and his earnestness disarmed criticism, disarmed it as far as he himself was concerned. Nobody believed his narrative, but all believed that he believed it. He made his enlargements without flourish, without emphasis, and so casually that often one failed to notice that a change had been made. He spoke of the governor of Vaucouleurs the first night simply as the governor of Vaucouleurs. He spoke of him the second night as his uncle, the governor of Vaucouleurs. The third night he was his father. He did not seem to know that he was making these extraordinary changes. They dropped from his lips in a quite natural and effortless way. By his first night's account the governor merely attached him to the maid's military escort in a general and unofficial way. The second night his uncle, the governor, sent him with the maid as lieutenant of her rear guard. The third night his father, the governor, put the whole command, maid and all, in his special charge. The first night the governor spoke of him as a youth without name or ancestry, but destined to achieve both. The second night his uncle, the governor, spoke of him as the latest and worthiest lineal descendant of the chiefest and noblest of the 12 paladins of Charlemagne. The third night he spoke of him as the lineal descendant of the whole dozen. In 3 nights he promoted the Count of Vendôme from a fresh acquaintance to a schoolmate, and then brother-in-law. At the king's audience everything grew in the same way. First the 4 silver trumpets were 12, then 35, and finally 96. And by that time he had thrown in so many drums and cymbals that he had to lengthen the hall from 500 feet to 900 to accommodate them. under his hand the people present multiplied in the same large way. The first 2 nights he contented himself with merely describing and exaggerating the chief dramatic incident of the audience, but the 3rd night he added illustration to description. He throned the barber in his own high chair to represent the sham king. Then he told how the court watched the maid with intense interest and suppressed merriment, expecting to see her fooled by the deception and get herself swept permanently out of credit by the storm of scornful laughter which would follow. He worked this scene up till he got his house in a burning fever of excitement and anticipation. Then came his climax. Turning to the barber, he said, "But mark you what she did. She gazed steadfastly upon that sham's villain face, as I now gaze upon yours, this being her noble and simple attitude, just as I stand now. Then turned she, thus, to me, and stretching her arm out, so, and pointing with her finger, she said, in that firm, calm tone which she was used to use in directing the conduct of a battle, 'Pluck me this false knave from the throne.' I, striding forward as I do now, took him by the collar and lifted him out and held him aloft, thus, as if he had been but a child." The house rose, shouting, stamping, and banging with their flagons, and went fairly mad over this magnificent exhibition of strength, and there was not the shadow of a laugh anywhere, though the spectacle of the limp but proud barber hanging there in the air like a puppy held by the scruff of its neck was a thing that had nothing of solemnity about it. "Then I set him down upon his feet, thus, being minded to get him by a better hold and heave him out of the window, which she bid me forbear, so by that error he escaped with his life. Then she turned her about and viewed the throng with those eyes of hers, which are the clear shining windows whence her immortal wisdom looketh out upon the world, resolving its falsities, and coming at the kernel of truth that is hid within them, and presently they fell upon a young man modestly clothed, and him she proclaimed for what he truly was, saying, 'I am thy servant, thou art the king.' Then all were astonished, and a great shout went up, the whole 6,000 joining in it, so that the walls rocked with the volume and the tumult of it." He made a fine and picturesque thing of the march out from the audience, augmenting the glories of it to the last limit of the impossibilities. Then he took from his finger and held up a brass nut from a bolt head which the head ostler at the castle had given him that morning, and made his conclusion thus: "Then the king dismissed the maid most graciously, as indeed was her desert, and turning to me, said, 'Take this signet ring, son of the Paladins, and command me with it in your day of need, and look you,' said he, touching my temple, 'preserve this brain, France has use for it, and look well to its casket also, for I foresee that it will be hooped with a ducal coronet one day.' I took the ring, and knelt and kissed his hand, saying, 'Sire, where glory calls, there will I be found. Where danger and death are thickest, that is my native air. When France and the throne need help, well, I say nothing, for I am not of the talking sort. Let my deeds speak for me, it is all I ask.' So ended the most fortunate and memorable episode, so big with future weal for the crown and the nation, and unto God be the thanks. Rise, fill your flagons. Now, to France and the King, drink!" They emptied them to the bottom, then burst into cheers and huzzas, and kept it up as much as 2 minutes, the Paladin standing at stately ease the while, and smiling benignantly from his platform. End of chapter 7. Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc by Mark Twain. Volume 1, Book 2, Chapter 8. Joan persuades her inquisitors. When Joan told the king what that deep secret was that was torturing his heart, his doubts were cleared away. He believed she was sent of God, and if he had been let alone, he would have set her upon her great mission at once. But he was not let alone. Tremouille and the holy fox of Rheims knew their man. All they needed to say was this, and they said it. "Your Highness says her voices have revealed to you, by her mouth, a secret known only to yourself and God. How can you know that her voices are not of Satan, and she is his mouthpiece? For does not Satan know the secrets of men, and use his knowledge for the destruction of their souls? It is a dangerous business, and your highness will do well not to proceed in it without probing the matter to the bottom." That was enough. It shriveled up the king's little soul like a raisin, with terrors and apprehensions, and straightway he privately appointed a commission of bishops to visit and question Joan daily, until they should find out whether her supernatural helps hailed from heaven or from hell. The king's relative, the Duke of Alençon, 3 years prisoner of war to the English, was in these days released from captivity through promise of a great ransom, and the name and fame of the maid having reached him, for the same filled all mouths now, and penetrated to all parts, he came to Chinon to see with his own eyes what manner of creature she might be. The king sent for Joan, and introduced her to the Duke. She said, in her simple fashion, "You are welcome. The more of the blood of France that is joined to this cause, the better for the cause and it." Then the two talked together, and there was just the usual result. When they departed, the Duke was her friend and advocate. Joan attended the king's mass the next day, and afterward dined with the king and the Duke. The king was learning to prize her company and value her conversation, and that might well be, for, like other kings, he was used to getting nothing out of people's talk but guarded phrases, colorless and non-committal, or carefully tinted to tally with the color of what he said himself, and so this kind of conversation only vexes and bores and is wearisome. But Joan's talk was fresh and free, sincere and honest, and unmarred by timorous self-watching and constraint. She said the very thing that was in her mind, and said it in a plain, straightforward way. One can believe that to the king this must have been like fresh cold water from the mountains to parched lips used to the water of the sun-baked puddles of the plain. After dinner Joan so charmed the Duke with her horsemanship and lance practice in the meadows by the castle of Chinon, whither the king also had come to look on, that he made her a present of a great black war-steed. Every day the commission of bishops came and questioned Joan about her voices and her mission, and then went to the king with their report. These pryings accomplished but little. She told as much as she considered advisable, and kept the rest to herself. Both threats and trickeries were wasted upon her. She did not care for the threats, and the traps caught nothing. She was perfectly frank and childlike about these things. She knew the bishops were sent by the king, that their questions were the king's questions, and that by all law and custom a king's questions must be answered. Yet she told the king in her naive way at his own table one day that she answered only such of those questions as suited her. The bishops finally concluded that they couldn't tell whether Joan was sent by God or not. They were cautious, you see. There were 2 powerful parties at court, therefore to make a decision either way would infallibly embroil them with one of those parties, so it seemed to them wisest to roost on the fence and shift the burden to other shoulders, and that is what they did. They made final report that Joan's case was beyond their powers, and recommended that it be put into the hands of the learned and illustrious doctors of the University of Poitiers. Then they retired from the field, leaving behind them this little item of testimony, wrung from them by Joan's wise reticence. They said she was a gentle and simple little shepherdess, very candid, but not given to talking. It was quite true, in their case. But if they could have looked back and seen her with us in the happy pastures of Domremy, they would have perceived that she had a tongue that could go fast enough when no harm could come of her words. So we traveled to Poitiers to endure there 3 weeks of tedious delay while this poor child was being daily questioned and badgered before a great bench of, what, military experts, since what she had come to apply for was an army and the privilege of leading it to battle against the enemies of France? Oh, no! It was a great bench of priests and monks, profoundly learned and astute casuists, renowned professors of theology. Instead of setting a military commission to find out if this valorous little soldier could win victories, they set a company of holy hair-splitters and phrase-mongers to work to find out if the soldier was sound in her piety and had no doctrinal leaks. The rats were devouring the house, but instead of examining the cat's teeth and claws, they only concerned themselves to find out if it was a holy cat. If it was a pious cat, a moral cat, all right, never mind about the other capacities, they were of no consequence. Joan was as sweetly self-possessed and tranquil before this grim tribunal, with its robed celebrities, its solemn state and imposing ceremonials, as if she were but a spectator and not herself on trial. She sat there, solitary on her bench, untroubled, and disconcerted the science of the sages with her sublime ignorance, an ignorance which was a fortress. Arts, wiles, the learning drawn from books, and all, like missiles, rebounded from its unconscious masonry and fell to the ground harmless. They could not dislodge the garrison which was within, Joan's serene great heart and spirit, the guards and keepers of her mission. She answered all questions frankly, and she told all the story of her visions and of her experiences with the angels and what they said to her, and the manner of the telling was so unaffected and so earnest and sincere, and made it all seem so lifelike and real, that even that hard practical court forgot itself and sat motionless and mute, listening with a charmed and wondering interest to the end. And if you would have other testimony than mine, look in the histories, and you will find where an eyewitness, giving sworn testimony in the rehabilitation process, says that she told that tale with a noble dignity and simplicity, and as to its effect, says in substance what I have said. 17 she was, 17, and all alone on her bench by herself, yet was not afraid, but faced that great company of erudite doctors of law and theology, and by the help of no art learned in the schools, but using only the enchantments which were hers by nature, of youth, sincerity, a voice soft and musical, and an eloquence whose source was the heart, not the head, she laid that spell upon them. Now, was not that a beautiful thing to see? If I could, I would put it before you just as I saw it. Then I know what you would say. As I have told you, she could not read. One day they harried and pestered her with arguments, reasonings, objections, and other windy and wordy trivialities, gathered out of the works of this and that and the other great theological authority, until at last her patience vanished, and she turned upon them sharply and said, "I don't know A from B, but I know this, that I am come by command of the Lord of heaven to deliver Orleans from the English power and crown the King of Reims, and the matters ye are puttering over are of no consequence." Necessarily those were trying days for her, and wearing for everybody that took part. But her share was the hardest, for she had no holidays, but must be always on hand and stay the long hours through, whereas this, that, and the other inquisitor could absent himself and rest up from his fatigues when he got worn out. And yet she showed no wear, no weariness, and but seldom let fly her temper. As a rule, she put her day through calm, alert, patient fencing with those veteran masters of scholarly sword-play, and coming out always without a scratch. One day a Dominican sprung upon her a question which made everybody cock up his ears with interest. As for me, I trembled, and said to myself, "She is done this time, poor Joan, for there is no way of answering this." The sly Dominican began in this way, in a sort of indolent fashion, as if the thing he was about was a matter of no moment. "You assert that God has willed to deliver France from this English bondage?" "Yes, he has willed it." "You wish for men-at-arms, so that you may go to the relief of Orleans, I believe?" "Yes, and the sooner the better." "God is all-powerful and able to do whatsoever thing he wills to do, is it not so?" "Most surely. None doubts it." The Dominican lifted his head suddenly, and sprung that question I have spoken of, with exultation. "Then answer me this. If he has willed to deliver France, and is able to do whatsoever he wills, where is the need for men-at-arms?" There was a fine stir and commotion when he said that, and a sudden thrusting forward of heads and putting up of hands to ears to catch the answer, and the Dominican wagged his head with satisfaction and looked about him collecting his applause, for it shone in every face. But Joan was not disturbed. There was no note of disquiet in her voice when she answered. He helps who help themselves. The sons of France will fight the battles, but he will give the victory." You could see a light of admiration sweep the house from face to face like a ray from the sun. Even the Dominican himself looked pleased to see his master stroke so neatly parried, and I heard a venerable bishop mutter, in the phrasing common to priest and people in that robust time, "By God, the child has said true. He willed that Goliath should be slain, and he sent a child like this to do it." Another day, when the Inquisition had dragged along until everybody looked drowsy and tired but Joan, Brother Seguin, professor of theology at the University of Poitiers, who was a sour and sarcastic man, fell to plying Joan with all sorts of nagging questions in his bastard Limousin French, for he was from Limoges. Finally he said,
"How is it that you understand those angels? What language did they speak?"
"French."
"Indeed. How pleasant to know that our language is so honored. Good French?"
"Yes, perfect."
"Perfect, eh? Well, certainly you ought to know. It was even better than your own, eh?"
"As to that, I believe I cannot say," said she, and was going on, but stopped. Then she added, almost as if she were saying it to herself, "Still, it was an improvement on yours." I knew there was a chuckle back of her eyes, for all their innocence. Everybody shouted. Brother Seguin was nettled, and asked brusquely,
"Do you believe in God?"
Joan answered with an irritating nonchalance, "Oh, well, yes, better than you, it is likely." Brother Seguin lost his patience, and heaped sarcasm after sarcasm upon her, and finally burst out in angry earnest, exclaiming,
"Very well, I can tell you this, you whose belief in God is so great. God has not willed that any shall believe in you without a sign. Where is your sign? Show it."
This roused Joan, and she was on her feet in a moment, and flung out her retort with spirit. "I have not come to Poitiers to show signs and do miracles. Send me to Orleans, and you shall have signs enough. Give me men-at-arms, few or many, and let me go." The fire was leaping from her eyes. Ah, the heroic little figure! Can't you see her? There was a great burst of acclamations, and she sat down blushing, for it was not in her delicate nature to like being conspicuous. This speech and that episode about the French language scored 2 points against Brother Seguin, while he scored nothing against Joan. Yet, sour man as he was a manly man and honest, as you can see by the histories, for at the rehabilitation he could have hidden those unlucky incidents if he had chosen. But he didn't do it, but spoke them right out in his evidence. On one of the latter days of that 3 weeks' session, the gowned scholars and professors made one grand assault all along the line, fairly overwhelming Joan with objections and arguments culled from the writings of every ancient and illustrious authority of the Roman Church. She was well nigh smothered, but at last she shook herself free and struck back, crying out, "Listen! The book of God is worth more than all these ye cite, and I stand upon it. And I tell ye, there are things in that book that not one among ye can read, with all your learning." From the first, she was the guest, by invitation, of the Dame de Rabateau, wife of the councillor of the Parliament of Poitiers, and to that house the great ladies of the city came nightly to see Joan and talk with her, and not these only, but the old lawyers, councillors, and scholars of the Parliament and the University. And these grave men, accustomed to weigh every strange and questionable thing, and cautiously consider it and turn it about this way and that, and still doubt it, came night after night, and night after night, falling ever deeper and deeper under the influence of that mysterious something, that spell, that elusive and unwordable fascination which was the supremest endowment of Joan of Arc, that winning and persuasive and convincing something which high and low alike recognized and felt, but which neither high nor low could explain or describe, and one by one they all surrendered, saying, "This child is sent of God." All day long Joan, in the great court and subject to its rigid rules of procedure, was at a disadvantage. Her judges had things their own way, but at night she held court herself, and matters were reversed, she presiding, with her tongue free and her same judges there before her. There could not be but one result, and all the objections and hindrances they could build around her with their hard labors of the day, she would charm away at night. In the end she carried her judges with her in a mass, and got her great verdict without a dissenting voice. The court was a sight to see when the president of it read it from his throne, for all the great people of the town were there who could get admission and find room. First there were some solemn ceremonies, proper and usual at such times. Then, when there was silence again, the reading followed, penetrating the deep hush, so that every word was heard in even the remotest parts of the house.
It is found, and is hereby declared, that Joan of Arc, called the Maid, is a good Christian and a good Catholic, that there is nothing in her person or her words contrary to the faith, and that the king may and ought to accept the succor she offers, for to repel it would be to offend the Holy Spirit, and render him unworthy of the air of God.
The court rose, and then the storm of plaudits burst forth unrebuked, dying down and bursting forth again and again, and I lost sight of Joan, for she was swallowed up in a great tide of people who rushed to congratulate her, and pour out benedictions upon her and upon the cause of France, now solemnly and irrevocably delivered into her little hands. End of chapter 8.
So in today's game of, did that really happen? The answer is yes. Yes, it did. Pretty much exactly the way Twain writes it. His version is more simple than some of the accounts of the meeting between Joan and the king. There are poets who have written versions that are very flowery, very, very flowery. Twain is restraining himself. However, it is true, all of it. She walked in with her 2 knights, not with our narrator, of course, and they were concerned that she would be overwhelmed by all of the light and the noise and the people, and she wasn't. Yolanda tried to dress her up in finery, and she said no. She presented herself very simply, which several people commented on, that she, by being so modest and normal, they didn't use that word, I'm using that word, she was so different that people shut up and paid attention. And they really did try and play the trick on her, and she really did recognize the Dauphin out of the entire crowd. She'd never talked to the guy on the throne. Now, Twain puts into the mouth of our narrator that she told the king that her voices had told her that he would be crowned Dauphin, and that more importantly, he was born legitimately to be the heir to the kingdom, and that was this great secret that was troubling him. That appears to have come from the trial of rehabilitation, where her personal priest, chaplain, father, was interviewed, and he's the one who gave that testimony. Now, that may be true, but it's likely not the entire thing, because that's actually a very short conversation that he quotes, whereas Joan and the Dauphin were speaking privately for quite some time. So there was more of a conversation that was going on there. And the king never talked about it, and Joan never talked about it, even though during the trial of condemnation, they asked her what she had said to the Dauphin at that point, and she would not speak of it. That was not her story to tell. Now, the other part that is true is it's mentioned super in passing in the 3rd chapter today, chapter 8, but it's also implied in the 2nd chapter. After meeting with the king decides that he needs to have his learned folks make sure that this is a good idea before committing, because this is a radical departure from normal protocol. For that time, while they were waiting for him to make up his mind and figure out who to send, she was housed with a family, an upright, a junior league lady type who was a member of the community, who was respected, and she and the other women would sit around and talk to Joan. So there was an interaction between the place and the people, the townies who live there, and these outsiders, the retinue that Joan brought with her and Joan herself. And some of those people also testified in the trial of rehabilitation that happened later. And of course, the women said exactly what you would expect them to say. She was modest, she was sweet, she was kind. She understood exactly what she was doing. She understood exactly how this was all going to go down. She didn't know anything at this point about the end result, but she knew she was going to be crowning the king. She knew roughly when, all of that. No proof of witchcraft, yada, yada. So that part of the second chapter today, chapter 7, is true. And then the third part. The third part is, historically speaking, probably the saddest, and a part that Twain really had to rely upon second and third document sources for his understanding of what happened. And this is because this is called the trial at Poitiers. Even though it wasn't really a trial, it was like a series of dawn rags. It was when all of the professors come in, you do orals before you do your doctorate kind of thing. This was more like that, where she wasn't on trial. She certainly wasn't captive. She was just told to show up and answer questions over these, I think it was a 2-week period, maybe. It wasn't all day, every day by any stretch, but it was a legitimate thing. And because it was a legitimate thing, there was somebody who was taking verbatim notes. And the book of Poitiers, the trial at Poitiers, disappeared a long time ago. Almost all of Joan's, what could be considered relics or museum-worthy leavings of Joan, things that she was either tangentially or legitimately connected to, almost all of those were destroyed during the French Revolution, which is heartbreaking and really upsetting to me. I am having a very hard time dealing with this because I just read the stories about that today. I'm putting a link out to an afterword from a book on the history of Joan of Arc. It's the afterword written by the author, where she goes through all of the research that she had to do to find out what had happened, if anything, to the relics. This is Joan's armor, Joan's sword, Joan's standard, her ring, her dress, all of these things. Twain states that you can see these things, or at least some of these things, in Orleans. That's because he is writing as Louis de Camp. At that time, Louis was telling the truth. These things had been saved. They were available to be seen. When Twain was writing, they no longer were. So that was Twain being a really good historian. He was making sure that what our narrator tells us is true, not an untrustworthy narrator, which is frustrating for us, but also clearly really important for Twain in this book, because he has a history of writing untrustworthy narrators, and not here at all. The questions that were asked by the Dominican and by Brother Seguin are real. Seguin himself had some cojones, man, because everybody else who interrogated her during this time chickened out and claimed, I was never there. I mean, talk about denying your Lord. I was never there. I was never part of it. I was helping Charles VII. They came up with all sorts of lousy little lies to get out of having to speak about what they did to Joan during the trial of rehabilitation, except for this one guy. I loved the question that the Dominican asked, though. So if God is going to do this, then I guess we don't need you to lead the battle. And it reminded me of that joke during a flood. Somebody is praying for God to save them, and so a car shows up saying, hey, we got to get out of here. Get in the car. No, God's going to save me. A boat comes along after, a few hours and the water's rising. Water's rising, get in the boat. We're going to save you. No, God's going to save me. After that, only thing left is the roof on the as dry space for this person to stand on. A helicopter comes along and says, get on the rope ladder. We're going to get you out of here. No, God is going to save me. And at the pearly gates, guy shows up and says, hey, why didn't you save me? And God says, I sent a car, a boat, and a helicopter. Joan's point is identical. It's going to be God's victory, but the victory is going to come because we're doing it. It still requires mortals to be involved in order to make it happen. Just because it's decreed or foreordained does not mean you don't have responsibilities. Now, with Brother Seguin, did she actually say the angel's French was better than his? Yes, she did. Apparently so, and he confirms it. Did she say that she knows God better than he does? Yes, she did, which is outrageous. I think absolutely outrageous, but I kind of got to trust this guy because it's a truly embarrassing thing as a story to tell about yourself if you are supposed to be a religious expert, that this snippet of a girl, 17-year-old, is basically calling you out on your lack of faith or your fair weather faith when it suits you. It's kind of impressive for him to have done that. At the same time, it is very likely that this also became a story that he had told elsewhere and that got a good laugh. And if he was that kind of person, like the paladin, you can kind of see how this story might have been embellished. And of course, we have lost the book from Poitiers, the actual transcription of the trial. But his story does get corroborated in other places other than the trial of rehabilitation. So, go Joan. And I believe John Greenman misspoke at the very end of the chapter. The line, and this is real. All of the things that are said at the end of this chapter are real. The finding of this tribunal was, it is found and is hereby declared that Joan of Arc, called the Maid, is a good Christian and a good Catholic, that there is nothing in her person or her words contrary to the faith, and that the king may and ought to accept the succor she offers, for to repel it would be to offend the Holy Spirit and render him unworthy of the aid of God. It's pretty impressive, right? It's easy to see why the document of this protocol needed to get lost, because that last part, that finding, is the direct opposite of what happens to Joan later. And so that's it. Next week is up in the air. I am not sure if I am going to be able to podcast because it is my birthday on Thursday. And that is probably going to put a kink into the schedule. But I'm going to do my best to bring you some more chapters. I'm just letting you know, might not happen. We'll see. Aside from that, have a great one. Be well. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. If you like what you hear on CraftLit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is CraftLit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of CraftLit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.